father was going to agree. I mean, I had lived such a sheltered, protected life. I wasn't even allowed to watch Titanic because there was a kissing scene in it. Whenever my brother's friends came home, I was dutifully asked to go and sit in the other room quietly for as long as the boys were in the house. My parents made sure that I realized that every man on this planet is my brother. Thank God, though, that my marriage was finally fixed. It was to happen in a month from that day. Finally, a man who would not be my brother. You can only imagine my excitement. But before tying the knot, there was one thing that I really wanted to do. Papa, I said, as tears welled up in my eyes, Papa, before I tie the knot and get tied down forever, can I for once experience what true freedom feels like? The iconic film DDLJ kept coming back to my mind. I had recently heard its story from a friend. Of course, I've never watched DDLJ because good girls don't watch romantic movies. But this inspiring story of a very shy Indian girl who went ahead and asked her father to send her on a Europe trip right before she tied the knot sang to me. And I did exactly that to my father as well. Of course, I asked for something much more financially reasonable. I told him, Papa, can I please go on a solo trip to the Himalayas? What? Beta, are you serious? My father was shocked. How could his demure, sweet little daughter ask for something as ghastly as this? A barrage of questions followed, following much cajoling, a lot of crying, and a lot more of emotional blackmailing. My father caved in and said yes. The next day, I picked my dust-gathering rucksack. I wore my good as new, 10 years old canvas shoes, and I went over to the ISPT bus depot in Delhi to get a bus to Dharamshala. It was an overnight journey. Once I reached the Dharamshala bus depot, I felt like I was surrounded by a tsunami of crowd. My brain felt so confused. What next? What next? What is it that I need to do? I think I need a porter, somebody to show me the path, somebody to walk me through this final walk of freedom. A really kind tea stall man told me I need to walk up to the Kareri village and there I will find a porter. So there I went on my very first hike of that trip. Up in the village, a woman held my hand and took me to a hut. She said, this is where you will find Chotu. Now, if you've lived in India long enough, you will know that every other girl in India is called Gudiya and every other boy in India is called Chotu. Of course, then, my brain pretty much figured out what is this Chotu going to look like. But lo and behold, I was so surprised. Chotu in this case turned out to be the quintessential Bollywood hero. Tall, dark, handsome, with his muscles tearing through his shirt like steel through lumber. For the very first time, I felt that my rucksack was weighing me down. Or was it the realization that I was finally falling in love? No, that is absolutely implausible. I'm going to be married in a few days to a well-educated, well-settled guy in a foreign country with a half-decent name called Churni Lal Tomar, or Chu, as his friends lovingly called him. And here stood in front of me perhaps a college dropout, a Highlander, a porter called Chotu, who perhaps has never seen the world outside of these hills and spoke no English beyond, hello, myself Chotu this side. What was I thinking? And yet we stood in that moment there, silent, for as long as I remember, just staring into each other's souls. The next few days just felt like living in the embrace of the most beautiful dream, Chotu and me amidst the vast Himalayan mountains. But then on the 7th day, we hit the dust track. The dust lifted and so did the curtain of illusion. I had to say my goodbye. My heart felt heavy and the pain of loss was so acute. Back home, I got busy with my wedding preparations. On that night, everybody left me in the room because they had to go and welcome the wedding procession. There were loud Punjabi songs playing outside, I still remember. And I also remember that I was lost deep in my thoughts that took me back and forth between what if and what now. Suddenly the door opened, and in front of me, the mirror reflected the image of Chotu. How? How did he even find my address? How did he come here? I had no idea. I just turned around and I ran up to him and I hugged him and I wept. And I wept with every piece of strength in my body. I have no recollection of what happened next. When I woke up, I could feel my hands were still shaking. There was sweat all over my face. I could still feel the tears on my eyes. But I was in my bed in London. And my husband was snoring right next to me. Was I dreaming? I was dreaming. Chotu was a part of a dream because my reality was too dark. 7 days ago, my mother had suddenly died. I was in the US on a work trip when I received this news on a very dreaded call. I couldn't reach in time for her last rites. So I watched my mother turn to ashes on a WhatsApp video call. Over the next few days, months, years, my body started to use storytelling as a form of coping with grief. Whenever the pain became too deep for me, I started getting these very fantastical dreams about this perfectly beautiful romantic world in which I could just comfortably huddle up and live without having to ever face the darkness of my reality. Hi everyone, my name is Sujata Setia. I am a photographer and a writer. And I pick up these imaginary narratives from my dreams and turn them into images. Some of this work you would have seen turn into memes, has gone viral all over the world. But my life hasn't exactly been a Karan Johar-like romantic saga. Though you see, I do give it a try. I was born in Jaipur amidst the rustic but unflinching guardrails of patriarchy and misogyny. The very first sound of music I ever heard was when I was in my mother's womb. I heard the sound of her body being dragged through the cemented floor by her hair as she pleaded for mercy. Over the next few years, that sound of violence became music for me. The very first ripple of rhythm I felt in my body was at the age of 3, when I was first sexually abused by a cousin. Over subsequent acts of abuse, my body learned how to normalize rhythms. I am both a product of trauma and abuse. So when my mother died, grief attached itself to my body like a million limbs. I asked myself, how is it that I'm going to ever survive this? How is it that I will heal? And how is it that I will continue to keep moving forward? This is what I did and what I continue to do. I acknowledged these limbs. I chose to walk alongside these limbs and not without them. The first step in the seeking of light is the realization that darkness is permanent. I knew I will never be able to let this grief go. So instead of treating it like a burden, I made it my instrument. I made grief my quill, and I chose to start writing with this quill. Now, grief is not just one. Grief is so many. Losing a loved one is grief. Breaking up with a lover is grief. Breaking your iPhone is grief. And crashing of your hard disk that had important data stuff inside it is certainly grief. So over the years, my grief kept growing. While well-wishers and loved ones came to my rescue, spoke with me, but they always wanted to put a timeline to my tears. And so I turned within. I started writing to myself. I wrote to myself through my yellow diary. And then I wrote to myself sometimes through a blog post that nobody except for me read. But the more I read, the more I started to locate patterns, showing me what is it that triggers this grief for me. And the more I found these patterns, the more it helped me find out techniques to deal with this grief, to live with this grief. Funnily, I realized that watching Ranveer Singh's movies heals me. Taking pictures of my beautiful daughter with my dog, that heals me. So I chose to make my healing technique my career. No, don't get me wrong. Not watching Ranveer Singh's films, but becoming a photographer. As a result, I have been internationally published. I am a globally well-renowned photographer who has traveled over 30 plus countries teaching photography and the art of brand building through storytelling to over 10,000 small businesses and photographers. But there is one thing that I always keep coming back to. The fact that on some days, the quill will run dry. On some days, as a person healing from grief, nothing will work for you. Talking to yourself won't work. Writing in your diary won't work. You will not understand your inner landscape, and certainly Ranveer's antics on your computer screen will not work. On those days, I make a conscious effort to just stop. I stop and I remind myself that I need this time to heal. That I'm stopping because at some point, I need to start walking again. I am stopping because at some point, I need that quill to fill some ink in it. But what I did was to refuse to be scared of ink blot. Sometimes, when you fill ink in quill, excess ink comes to the tip of the quill and it blots the paper. Sometimes when you stop, grief starts to grow around you and makes the burden insurmountable. But I made sure never to let the fear of ink blot stop me from writing. I made sure never to let the burden of grief stop me from walking 2 steps forward. Because blotted paper is art and grief is inspiration. Whatever my pain, I have always turned it into an oasis of imagination. When my mother passed, I asked myself, how is it that I can express this pain in a language that exists outside of words? Creative expression came to my rescue. I started working on a series called Changing the Conversation, in which I collaborate with people with visible and invisible differences. Differences that make them stand out in the society. Differences that make them the other. In the process of creating this series, I realized that I have found a purpose that is so much greater, so much more important than my pain. And that has been my deepest and most profound form of healing. So please, go ahead and change the conversation. Change the conversation not only that you are having with the world, but change the conversation most importantly that you are having with yourself. This grief is not my burden. This grief is beauty waiting to be translated. I am not a victim. I am a survivor. These are not scars. These are experiences. Every step of the way, I have stopped asking myself this question, why me? Everyone seems to be asking that. Unfortunately, pain is pervasive. Each one of us has it in different measures. So no, I do not have the right to ask myself why me. Instead, I ask myself, how is it that I can make this grief my superpower? When this grief tries to throw me off the cliff, I try harder to start flying. When this grief suffocates me, I try to grow my endurance. When this grief tries to put me inside the water and drown me, I start paddling faster. But at every step of the way, I make sure that if this grief is trying to make me lose the battle, I come back and remind myself that there is always a way to win. All you need to do is keep trying. Thank you so much.